I will start with simple questions, but not sure about answers to be simple to give. Why the war in Ukraine became unavoidable? Why the President Putin is still able to continue shell bombs over Ukraine? Why the West is unsuccessful to stop him? And actually all these whys refer to the Western powers, to the democratic world, which is considered to be stronger than Russia, economically, militarily, but still this strength is kind of useless to save those who are under Russian shells right now in Ukraine.
First, this war was not unavoidable. It was a war of choice, and it is a war of aggression by Vladimir Putin. Nothing about this war is unavoidable. It is his own choice and his choice alone. The West is clearly doing a lot to not only stop this war, but also weaken an authoritarian Russia so it cannot conduct future wars in this way. It is arming and supplying the Ukraine military in a pretty unprecedented way over the last 14 days, in a concerted and massive attempt at supporting Ukraine. That is part of the reason, but a small part of the reason, because the big part, of course, is the spirit of the Ukrainian people resisting oppression. And secondly, the package of sanctions is massive, especially the sanctions vis-a-vis the Russian central bank. Mm-hmm. So I believe that these sanctions are going to have an effect on the stability of the war machine and the system. And I don't want to be in Mr. Putin's shoes. This war is not going too well for him.
You are not fond of catastrophe predictors. So do I. So what could be the food for the optimists in today's reality? So liberal democracy versus neo-authoritarianism, the West versus Putin's war machine, an old dilemma, intervening or not to.
The West has decided not to intervene militarily, and has done that from the first minute onward, and it has been very clear about that. It will support Ukraine, including with arms deliveries, but it will not get involved into the war militarily. That it has said from day one. But should NATO territory in the Baltics or elsewhere be attacked by Russia, NATO will defend, and as Mr. Biden and Mr. Scholz said, every inch of NATO territory will be defended. And make no mistake about it, that will happen. I'm pretty certain that it will. Now, what's the cause of optimism? The cause of optimism is Western unity and democratic resilience in this. Many people, including Mr. Putin's regime, have talked about strong Russia and a weak West. And yes, if you mistake Western willingness to compromise, if you mistake Western disunity and differences of opinion between Western states, also competition between Western states, as weakness, then you've seen some of that. But that's the nature of what democracies are all about. They're also very patient, and they're suffering through a lot of abuse and trying to accommodate other partners in ways in negotiations. Mr. one of the miscalculations that Mr. Putin made was that the West, especially Europe, would be disunited and would have a token response and would then run out and in every direction. Exactly that didn't happen. The Western response was coordinated, it is strong, and it is united, and that is something that Mr. Putin did not expect, and he miscalculated on that front. That gives me cause for optimism. It's sometimes Israeli politician Abba Eber used to say, democracies do the right thing after having explored all other options. I think that's what you're seeing here.
But if the war on the territory of Ukraine continues and Russia does not cross the NATO line, how long could it continue then? This question is still about intervention. A couple of days ago, President Zelensky said, how many more lives and loss is necessary for ensuring Ukraine's sky to be safe, to be closed? Kharkiv and Mykolaiv residents, how do they differ from those in Hamburg, those of Hamburg and Vienna?
Mm-hmm.
That's a very important question, I think.
It is an important question, and it is a misconception to believe that the skies can be safe without Western intervention. A no-fly zone is not a humanitarian intervention. It is a military intervention. It means that you will have to disable Russian air defenses. It means that you will have to shoot down Russian aircraft to establish it. It means an intervention into the war. This is exactly what Western leaders have ruled out. They will not intervene into this war, and whatever Mr. Putin says or makes you believe, this is not what is going to happen, and that's why the decision was made not to create so-called safe skies.
Never.
I can't foresee a moment.
Because we saw quite an important shifts in Western politics, foreign policy. For example, Germany's shift, maybe not actually unexpected, let's say. I mean, in its speed and sharpness.
Yes, I have to agree on that this course correction by the new Chancellor Scholz was significant, but it only happened because it had been prepared. Germany had been under pressure from its own people, from its own population, and from all of its allies to be too accommodating, to be too slow, too late in a life or death situation for Ukraine. It became clear that once Mr. Putin had chosen to intervene in full scale in a tank battle into Ukraine, that the Western peace order of the post-1990 era was over. That was a different era. This is why this is such a historic moment. And the German government, having had the longest distance to go to this point, tacked pretty impressively within a number of days toward a position where you no longer accommodate Russia, but want to punish and weaken Russia, and to wean itself off of energy dependence rather than seek interdependence as a means to be dependent on each other to ensure peace. Clearly, that strategy has not worked. The opposite has worked. We're now so dependent on Russian energy that we cannot impose an import stop immediately. So the strategy has backfired. It will take a while to course correct it. The measures to course correct are underway militarily and in terms of energy policy.
Today, everybody admits the world will never be the same. what do you think will be the determinant of the future international order? How would it look like, a fresh start for a liberal order?
I don't discount the liberal order even under these conditions. But it will not be a global international order, but it will be a bounded international order. All those who associate themselves with it will follow a rules-based system. But there is a larger number of authoritarian countries, and unfortunately I would have to admit that the number of these authoritarian countries is growing and not declining, that will not want to be part of such a border and of such an order.
Yeah.
And therefore I expect competition between systems rather than the expectation of a universal global approach to order setting.
Today we see a lack of stability of liberal international order, and it looks like a summer house built with the perspective and belief of an eternal summer. So, does it still look like a summer house?
It's getting reinforcements for fall and winter. That's what we're seeing. We're seeing that summer house that was built for the good times, was built for the sunshine, will need to have some philosophical underpinnings, and it will have to have some new real woodwork to be added to the house. Philosophically, we will need to adopt something that I like to call robust liberalism, a limited but defense-oriented liberalism. And we will need, as physical defenses, something that Germany has already announced, France has followed suit, and many other European countries will follow suit in investing more in defense. We will also need to defend our democracies internally because they are under threat from internal actors as well. We have been reminded by the doubts in our own population and by the attacks from the outside onto the democratic system that democracy needs a strong defense. And in that sense, Mr. Putin's blatant violation of all principles, starting with the principle of national sovereignty, was a very good reminder of that. I think a lot of Western countries had gotten careless, also arrogant about the liberal system. That is one of the unintended consequences of Mr. Putin's aggressive action, that unity plus defense and defense of principle as well of defense of order will be the result of what we're seeing now.
Yeah, Russia, the one that follows so-called street rules on international arena, tells the West, the one that follows the principle of rules-based international order. It sounds in Russian like Lavrov said, "Пацан сказал, пацан сделал," which means a guy said a word and a guy fulfilled it. So Pацан continues, and the West cannot stop him. Does that future you just described, and how does it depend on the length of the war which is going on now and on its results? Physical results, material results, I mean.
It does depend on that. We very much depend on the courage and the endurance of the Ukrainian people, because the result of this war is not going to be victory for Vladimir Putin's war machine, even if he takes territory. The question will then be whether he can hold territory. And the Ukrainians in history post-1917 and post-1945 have shown that they are willing to continue to fight in guerrilla warfare against what they consider to be occupants. Therefore, the idea that Russia, without paying a price, can submerge Ukraine for years and forever is far-fetched. Therefore, I expect a weakened Russia, a militarily weakened Russia, an isolated Russia, a Russia that will emerge as a pariah state from this, with no access to technology, no access to finance, no international trade, dependent on China, a junior partner at best, a vassal at worst. So I don't see a good outcome, even with some military successes for Vladimir Putin. I see a dangerous Russia because it's going to be still nuclear armed, even though militarily weakened.
What about Ukraine, paying the most price so far?
That's the so far good story in the sense of its endurance and its fighting spirit for its freedom and independence, but clearly it is paying a heavy price, and that price, the longer it takes, will be continuously higher as we see more cities under attack and more cities being flattened by Putin's war machine. So in future, hoping that there will be a free Ukraine, it will need Europe and it will need the United States to help it rebuild, and to help it sustain the freedom that they have fought for so hard.
And what about the mission of a country like Georgia, of a small country in this global turmoil, in this global confusion, let's say? How should we survive?
It will, the situation will very much depend on the outcome of that war, because how weakened is Russia going to be, and what positions do Russia's neighbors find themselves in? Russia is not going to go away. It is still going to have 11 time zones, and it's still going to be a big neighbor to a small country. But on the other hand, there is going to be a reconstituted and re-strengthened and rededicated West interested in relations with and good relations with countries like Georgia and Georgia specifically. So there's going to be some choices are going to have to be made by the Georgians themselves on how to relate to a weakened yet, in my view, likely dangerous Russia, and a West that is going to have a renewed interest and renewed allegiance to countries that border onto Russia along the eastern flank of NATO.
Do you foresee any compromise possible on Ukraine from the West? Taking into consideration growing number of casualties and losses.
The example I have in front of me is the Dayton Accord in the 1990s Balkan Wars, when the United States armed the Bosnian Muslims and the Bosnian Croats and changed the situation on the battlefield so that Milosevic at that point became interested in making peace. So I do believe that a precondition for a peace settlement it will be to change the complexion on the battlefield. That is why it is so important that the Ukrainians are fighting so heroically, and that it will be so important for Western countries to send arms to Ukraine quickly. Then, at some point, Mr. Putin will likely be interested in getting out of this, what I think is ending up in a quagmire for him. At that point, you're going to have a political solution. What that political solution looks like is very hard to predict at this point, because it will be very much dependent on the military situation. But without a disadvantageous change for Mr. Putin, he is not going to want to compromise. In fact, I would warn against the dangers of de-escalation and peace negotiations at this time, since he has achieved none of his war goals. Anything that gives him time and buys him time will only be able to re-strengthen and refill his tanks and his weapons and his logistic chains in order for him to run the next attack. We should be very wary of such a scenario.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much.
Thank you.